This is the 415ers podcast brought to you by the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network 95.7 The Game. Please download the Odyssey app, download the podcast, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. That is Marc Grandi. I am Evan Giddings, coming at you twice a week here in the off season, each and every week. So the next thing I wanted to discuss, Marc, is Christian McCaffrey, because we finally got a quote out of the guy, and he kind of flies under the radar. Have seen him at some Warriors games, but for the most part, since he's been in San Francisco, he has enjoyed his time and said as much at the Dwight Clark event series, saying that I firmly believe that this is the best thing that's ever happened to me as far as his football career is concerned. I don't doubt that. I mean, he was drafted to a franchise that at the time had Cam Newton, but he was kind of down and on his way out, and was asked to be the guy to basically shoulder an entire offensive load. And now he can continue to be just as efficient as he previously was, but he has so much more help around him. He has so much more schematic aid from the coaching staff. And of course, he has the buy-in from the front office that was willing to spend big draft capital to go out and bring him here, a place he's very familiar with, being at Stanford. And it feels like he's right at home. So the question that I wanted to pose to people, because I do want to dig into this a little more, is, can CMC run like he did last year in 2022 again?
I think he can be as explosive and as efficient. I'm not sure we see the volume for Christian McCaffrey as much this coming season, and that's nothing against him. You just remember when he was acquired, the 49ers weren't playing poorly, but they were kind of in a middle ground where you needed to make a run. And of course, we all know they made a run. I mean, the 49ers did not lose with Christian McCaffrey as their starter. His first game was against the Chiefs. And then, he came off the bench in that game, didn't start and didn't play a ton of snaps. The next game was on the road against the Rams. He had the trifecta of touchdowns, throwing, receiving, and rushing. The rest is history. They didn't lose in the rest of the regular season. They won their first two playoff games before, of course, the disaster in the NFC title game. So I say all that just to say that the 49ers needed him, and they leaned on him heavily, especially very early in his tenure. Once they won, 6-7 straight games, they clinched the NFC West. They could kind of take their foot off the pedal a little bit, Evan, and ease him into, being healthy and ready for the postseason. But they were still trying to chase a high seed. I mean, it was the conversation all year long. Would they catch Minnesota? The conversation you and I spent a lot of time about last season. The Jalen Hurts injury kept the 1 seed as a possibility for the 49ers until the very end of the regular season. So I think Christian McCaffrey, there's no reason to believe, and I know his injury history is a little scary, but for me, there's no reason to believe that he cannot be as efficient as he was in 2022 this coming year, and as explosive. I just don't think we will see the same high quantity of touches and therefore total yards. I mean, in 10 games, 11 games, he had over 1,200 yards from scrimmage. I mean, that is an incredible number, and it's certainly up to par with what he's done when he's been healthy in his career. But I think Kyle Shanahan and company will ease back on the number of touches for McCaffrey. At least that's ideal if they have health elsewhere on offense. And if they can't afford to do that, I think they will. So that's my only thing with McCaffrey. I don't think we will see the same volume, but we'll see the same efficiency.
I'm sort of with you. I'm a little more hesitant than you are, just because I think they're going to need him a lot, especially at the beginning of this year, if they don't know who their quarterback is, or if they have a non-Brock Purdy led offense. And even with Brock Purdy, he leaned on number 23 a whole hell of a lot. That's a big reason they won a ton of games. But why I would temper expectations about McCaffrey putting up another 1,900 scrimmage yard season, even though he's obviously capable of doing that and has done more than that in his time in Carolina, is Christian McCaffrey is about to be 27 years old. And that is about the time we see running backs begin to decline. And if you want to take a look at something outside of age, well, then touches, Marc, is where you would go.
Hmm.
He touched the ball, including the playoffs, almost 400 times last year, I should say. That is the second most in his career. If you look at the guys from his draft class from 2017 beyond, Ezekiel Elliott is at the top. He has obviously begun to fade. He did before last year. Derrick Henry is superhuman. He's 6'5", 260, and even he has shown signs of decline this past season. Alvin Kamara's kind of a different issue, but he dropped off when Drew Brees left. Dalvin Cook is really the only guy that has played the same roughly amount of games and gotten a similar amount of touches as Christian McCaffrey. But even he looked a little less explosive last season than in prior years. All I'm saying is Christian McCaffrey has touched the ball 1,500 times in his career. And this is about the time we see running backs begin to decline. And it's why I think, to your point about the efficiency, or I should say the total touches, the 49ers are well aware of that and will try and manage the load of his touches, his attempts. But to me, he's so integral to what they do offensively that I wonder if they're afforded that luxury because they need him to do that. And when your quarterback is questionable at the beginning of the year, you are going to need 23 to touch the ball potentially 20 times a game. I don't think he can do that for another 17-game season, assuming you want to keep him healthy, because even though he played the full year, he looked great, including down the stretch all the way through the playoffs. As you kind of alluded to, Mark, he played 10 games the prior 2 seasons because of injuries. I am assuming he won't get hurt, but I don't see him being the same running back as last year just because of all the factors that align: the age, the touches. I would just push people in the direction of don't expect the same 23 in 2023 as we saw in 2022.
That's fair. I'm glad you brought up touches because I was immediately going to fire back when you talked about his age, saying, well, he played 10 games over a 2-year stretch. Like, he is not as old as his age might suggest because he had really a couple of off years where he wasn't, banging in between tackles. But of course, as you put, and you very, very smartly put it, well, even in the years when he was playing, he was getting way more touches than anyone else. So it's really like he's played full seasons every year, and he just has an average number of touches for the starting running backs across the league. So that's a good point as well. But I do think there's something to, and I know you want to jump in here. I do think there's also something to say. He hasn't had the load on him specifically over the last 3 seasons. And I know off seasons help, and you can kind of bounce back from a tough season just via one off season. But I do think you consider the last 3 years of his career, only one has been a full season. I think that makes your body feel a little bit healthier, feel a little bit better, and make you feel a little bit more ready for a potential heavy load, even if you already have a ton of carries on you in your career as a whole.
No, I was just going to add, Mark, that so Ezekiel Elliott, we can all identify as a guy who is his best days are behind him, and they might have been behind him a couple of years ago. So it's not exactly the same. But if Christian McCaffrey gets the same amount of touches he did last year, which includes the postseason, he is going to be at the same amount of touches that Ezekiel Elliott is currently at. And I just have a hard time believing that won't take a toll. Now, maybe Christian McCaffrey is superhuman, and I think he's probably pretty close. But you look at the amount of running backs throughout history that have received the workload that he has in non-injury seasons, and this is about the time they start to decline a little bit. But I think that's also why, to your point on our last episode, why the 49ers feel like this has to be the year in a way. This has to be the year that they go in. And I think Christian McCaffrey, I'm very curious to see how he is load managed throughout this season in game, because they'll need him at the end, but I think they'll also need him throughout the 17-game regular season.
I think that's where this becomes an important conversation. What you brought up about Ezekiel Elliott, you're 100% right that he has fallen off a cliff. I think a big reason is because Dallas has mismanaged him, and they just endlessly fed him the ball. And you can understand why. He was a fantastic running back for the first 6 years of his 7 years of his career out of college, out of Ohio State. he was incredible and they gave him every possible touch. But even over the last couple of years, when they had a really dynamic backup in Tony Pollard, they still refused to cut back on his touches. And look what has happened as a result. So I think something that you already mentioned, the 49ers have the foresight and the forethought to know this. And I think they are very, very aware that they need to be careful with Christian McCaffrey's workload. And while you do, of course, want to give him the ball almost every single play, you have to fight back against that instinct because you do not want to lose such a dynamic player, of course, for a season, for a stretch of games, but you also don't want to, I don't know, further hurt or injure your star for future seasons. You want to conserve him and make him as good as he can be for a long time. And I am confident that the 49ers will not make the mistake, at least to the same extent that the Dallas Cowboys did. Now, maybe, as what you're saying, they need him early in the year. If Sam Darnold is starting games, if Trey Lance is starting games, whatever the situation is. But I do think as a whole this season, the 49ers are aware of that and will not run him into the ground, potentially injuring him this year or maybe shortening his career in the future.
Well, I certainly hope so because he's dynamic. He's really, really fun to watch. And obviously, he's a big part of this 49ers franchise.